I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. In June 2020, Indian and Chinese forces engaged in a deadly clash along their disputed border in the Ladakh region. It was the deadliest confrontation since the 1962 India-China War. Subsequently, bilateral ties between India and China deteriorated to their lowest level in decades. In recent months, however, China and India have begun to thaw their relationship. Last October, India and China struck a border patrol deal. Indian Prime Minister Modi and China's leader Xi Jinping subsequently met at the BRICS summit in Kazan. It was their first meeting in 5 years. And that was followed by a round of talks by their senior officials just a few weeks ago. To discuss the status and trajectory of India-China relations, including how the second Trump presidency and other geopolitical developments are likely to influence that relationship, I'm delighted to have with me today as my guest, Dr. Tanvi Madan. Tanvi is a senior fellow in the Center for Asia Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She's also author of the book, Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Tanvi.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. As a longtime listener and fan of the pod, I'm delighted to be on.
Wonderful. Well, I want to start by discussing the recent Border Patrol agreement, what actually was agreed upon, since I think the Chinese side has said very little, if anything, about the agreement. And really, Delhi hasn't said very much either. So I want to first define 3 terms that are relevant and then turn to you to analyze what exactly was achieved in this agreement. So you have the term that's used, disengagement, which means both sides stepping back from confrontation, essentially. De-escalation is when forces return to certain areas at a distance from the disputed location. And then there's this third term, de-induction, which is when both sides permanently remove troops and equipment and infrastructure from the area. So with this background, what exactly did the 2 sides achieve in this agreement? Do we know? Do both sides agree that what the objective is, which my understanding is to disengage and de-escalate, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then thirdly, how high is the risk that this agreement will unravel?
So, Bonnie, I think you described the 3-step process that we've heard from Indian policymakers about how they see this process going forward. And what we saw with this agreement is the completion of that first step, disengagement. So just for some context, the border standoff and clash that took place in 2020, after that, there were a number of rounds of dialogue between the 2 sides at 3 different, or at least 2 different levels. One was amongst the military commanders, the corps commanders at the border, and second, the bureaucratic process, the diplomatic process that is called the working mechanism to sort these things out. And during the course of both those sets of conversations, we did see till 2022 disengagement, as you described it, at a number of the points where the standoff in 2020 had occurred. What we saw in the recent agreement is disengagement at the 2 remaining points, Depsang and Demchok, both in kind of the eastern Ladakh sector or the western sector of the overall India-China border where the standoff had taken place. So we have seen now an announcement from India that disengagement has taken place. They also mentioned the restoration of patrolling rights. Prior to 2020, both sides had protocols in place all along the border, but also at the line of actual control, where they would inform each other of when there would be patrolling. Both sides would patrol what I've often called both man's land, a territory that both claim. And what we've seen is a statement from India saying that those patrolling rights have been restored in these areas. What we don't know, though, and there's considerable amount we don't know, is how China sees this. The Chinese statement was very 30,000-foot level. It said that the issues in 2020 had been resolved. Very little details about how they see the agreement or specifying what they agreed to. Another thing we don't know, in the course of the disengagement agreements, for the other points of standoff, they had announced buffer zones being created to allow both sides where there would be no man's land, essentially turning it from both man's land to no man's land. Are we going to see or have we seen any agreement on that? No, we haven't. So there's a lot not known about these agreements. At this point, what we do know is that disengagement has been completed. The Indian side has said what they would like to see now is now talks about de-escalation and de-induction. They have not talked about that that the India-China relationship is normalized. As one Indian official put it, this is opening the door to the path of normalization. And so when you asked about risk, is there a risk that this could unravel? To some extent, yes. But the broader set of reasons the two sides reached this point, after all, they could have reached this point earlier. There was a context in which they reached this point where both sides agreed they wanted to stabilize relations, or to put it in American terms, set a floor to the relationship. As long as those persist, I think this agreement will hold. But I don't think anybody is holding their breath that this is not going to happen again. And so, one of the things the two sides have to do is now engage in discussions about new protocols at the border to reduce the risk. Though, as many people in India will say, there's no way you can eliminate the risk. And so, it's not necessarily even going to be trust but verify. It's going to be verify, don't trust.
I'm curious about your thoughts as to why the two sides decided to stabilize the relationship. There are some experts who believe that there were some economic incentives on both sides. Others have maintained that India actually wants to reduce dependence on the U.S. and preserve its strategic autonomy. I think that's probably not my view or your view, but I've seen people argue that. And some people say that China really wanted to stop India's drift toward the United States, which might be a factor in Beijing's thinking. But what do you think?
I think perhaps a confluence of factors on both sides. And Bonnie, you know China better than I do. But my sense is that we have seen, not just with India, but with China reaching out to a number of countries with which it had friction points to try to stabilize relations, not just the U.S. Under the Biden administration, but also Australia, also Japan and South Korea to some extent. There have been exceptions, obviously, places like Philippines, but nonetheless, this, much like the actual crisis in 2020 that led to this point between India and China, this seems to be part of a broader set of engagements that China engaged in. And now what we've seen is the reasons may be similar for those other outreaches, that China feeling strategic and economic pressure, that China perhaps concerned about what a future or the next American administration might bring. And as you said, that factor of perhaps wanting to stall the deepening of India's ties with several other Chinese rivals like the US, but others as well, bilaterally and in the context of the quadrilateral, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the US. On the Indian side, I think also a combination of factors, not wanting to see another escalation at the border, perhaps wanting to buy some time to build its strengths, its capabilities, its partnerships. Some uncertainty about what, on India's part too, about what a next U.S. administration's China policy might be. And keep in mind that this is all taking place before the election, so the result wasn't known. But nonetheless, the uncertainty about what a next American administration might do vis-a-vis China, and for India, the US has become a key balancer as it thinks about China's role in the region and bilaterally vis-a-vis India. So I think those factors, as well as I think two or three other things. One, and India not feeling necessarily strategic and economic pressure, but having to grapple with the fallout of multiple global crises, including after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including the crisis in the Middle East, and not wanting one more thing to have to worry about. And then also this aspect of India, as you alluded to, some saying in India that actually India should do literally business with China, that economic ties should go back to being normal, that much like during the 2000s, people arguing that India should be taking advantage of the Chinese economy and seeing it once again not as a vulnerability but as an opportunity. And then finally, this aspect of India perhaps also thinking that if every other country had some sort of engagement with China and India didn't, that would leave India vulnerable to additional Chinese pressure. Does the US or wanting strategic autonomy play a role? Perhaps to the extent that some might have been arguing that it never hurts India to remind its partners like the US that it has options. But as we'll probably discuss, there are limited options for India when it comes to China. This is not India going to walk a middle path between China and the US.
Following the meeting between Xi Jinping and Modi in Kazan, India's national security advisor met with China's foreign minister, who, of course, is also the director of the Foreign Affairs Commission, Wang. That was in mid-December. And I know you read very closely the readouts of these meetings, which are always important. Often the Chinese readouts at the very top, they just include what Xi Jinping said at the opening of the meeting, which was the main sort of Chinese message. So what did they agree on? What's your assessment of what transpired at that meeting?
I think the meeting between Wang Yi and Yi-Ajit Doval, the national security advisor, in particular, kind of, I think, symbolized. It was partly symbolic in that it signified a return to formal dialogue. This is the special representatives process, which was meant in some ways to focus on not just what those two other dialogues I mentioned, the bureaucratic level and the military level dialogues, which were supposed to focus on, keeping discussing the border at the bureaucratic and military level. This special representatives dialogue, as initially envisioned, was actually supposed to talk about the border more strategically, thinking about potentially not just trying to maintain peace and tranquility at the border, as both sides put it, but also potentially resolve this border dispute. And so, in some ways, this dialogue, the special representatives talks, which had not been held since 2019, was a symbol of that return to dialogue, which we know that this Kazan agreement really signified. This is one thing we know that agreement signified: a return to dialogue. What we also saw, though, and in that, but also there was a meeting between Wang Yi and the Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar as well. We see, as you said, some differences in emphasis. India is still again and again emphasizing is that the border is crucial, and the status of the border, what's happening at the border, is crucial to the broader relationship. That if there is peace and tranquility at the border, if the two sides, actually follow through, implement implement what is agreed to between the two sides, then you will see that the broader relationship can normalize and potentially flourish. The Chinese side talking about the opposite, that, this border issue, yes, it's something that goes on the side, but actually both sides should focus on the broader relationship. And that's so the way there's a short form of it is the Indian side says border before broader relationship, and the Chinese side says broader relationship over the border. And so you've seen that emphasis continue, but you did see some specific movement ahead on some other issues, some potential, the agreement, though we don't know the details yet, of potential confidence building measures needing to reinstate or revise some of them. We've also seen, for instance, the Indian side talk about a return to, there's a pilgrimage that takes place in Tibet, that there was the Chinese side had facilitated a certain number of pilgrims from India would go every year, potentially that would be revived. We don't have details. And one other thing we found out, which we didn't know had been stopped, but the official acknowledgement that the data sharing about the Brahmaputra River, or what India calls the Brahmaputra River, which starts in Tibet and flows into India and then Bangladesh, that the data sharing would be restored. Now, what this tells us is that the Chinese had stopped this hydrological data sharing, and we had not heard about this before. So inadvertently, we're actually learning about how much it actually happened since 2020. So we've got a few details, but not a lot. Meantime, however, we're seeing other things continue on the competitive side, including reports that there will be one of the largest dams built that would affect, for example, even something like the Brahmaputra, deep implications for India, as well as the continued infrastructure buildup on both sides and the development of military upgrades, again, on both sides of the India-China border.
You mentioned the military CBMs between China and India, and of course, those have been in place for decades and are far more advanced than between China and any other of its neighbors. And my understanding is that they were successful for quite a long time in the limited aims, of course, that they were supposed to achieve. Is it possible to, you mentioned potentially revise them, but is it possible to just revive them? Is more mutual trust necessary in order to do that? And if so, is it really possible to restore that mutual trust after what happened in June of 2020?
So I think it's interesting. There were these 5 sets of agreements that laid out the kind of mechanisms, the protocols to essentially not necessarily resolve the border dispute, but for both sides saying from a process that's really started in 1988, but it takes place. The first agreement is signed in 1993, the last in 2013, and these 5 agreements, both sides agreed, would allow them to manage the border dispute and therefore open the space for that broader relationship. What we saw in 2020, and in some instances before, but especially in 2020, when India accused China of trying to change the status quo at multiple points of the line of the border in Ladakh, that is in the western sector, is that on the one hand, it was clear that these agreements were insufficient. However, and in fact, you heard the Indian side most taken by the fact, I think you heard repeatedly from a lot of India's China hands who'd helped negotiate those agreements, is saying China has violated the agreements. One even said they lie in a dustbin of history. Having said that, what we also saw, while they were clearly not sufficient in terms of a deterrent to the PLA moving, what we did see is that they were important in helping manage escalation and in now managing the two sides getting to this point of disengagement and potentially moving forward. So we do know that it's not like the agreements have been useless, but they are insufficient. Now, one of the reasons there has to be some sort of discussion about these agreements is since they've been signed, a lot has taken place in terms of infrastructure buildup, in terms of military upgradation. They haven't prevented any of that. But also because of technology, now some of these agreements, on the one hand, had to be rethought. The second part is what you mentioned, trust. I actually think both sides have to almost go into thinking about these agreements assuming there will be little to no trust. Because at least on the Indian side, I have seen, in fact, you've seen this in the reaction, very little celebration about these agreements. If anything, the public reaction, the strategic community's reaction is being, but can we trust that China will not do again what it did in 2020? And part of it is, I don't think this can be a relationship, at least in the short term, where trust can be assumed. It has to be rebuilt, and that's going to be a hard process because of what happened in 2020. So I think there has to be not a throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but a really rethinking about how can you operate in an environment, how can you revise the agreements in an environment where there is actually very little trust. And so a lot of that is going to have to do with verification mechanisms and technologies, but I think it's also going to mean that this will be a step-by-step process. Any easing that India does, whether I doubt it'll be very much at the border, India will continue to try to build its deterrent capabilities in terms of its military infrastructure. But there are other things that China wants India to ease up on, which are not, to do with the border, to do with economic ties, visas, etc. I suspect what India will do is do that step by step, which is see if there is continued implementation. Is this new agreement holding? Then India will say, yes, we'll do X or we'll do Y or Z. But it will be step by step, I think. And especially, right now in the winter, even though the 1962 war took place in the winter, it's where where this terrain is, the weather is really bad. You don't tend to see movement. One test will come in spring. Will this hold in spring? What will we see in spring? And so I think this is going to be step by step, and there will have to be some relook at these agreements to see are new. Is it? How can they be updated?
Many experts, yourself included, argue that the significance of this thaw really shouldn't be overstated because the India China relationship is deeply fraught and has just been transformed fundamentally by the clash that took place in June of 2020. There are others who argue that we're on the cusp of this détente that will be strategically significant. So why do you think, what's your, the thinking behind your view that this relationship will not return to what it was and will remain deeply mistrustful?
I think I am definitely on the side of those who think that we cannot overstate how much this relationship can move back to what it was before 2020, or for that matter, before what it was in 2012, so pre Xi Jinping. And the reason I say that is twofold: one to do with the border, one to do with the broader relationship. I think what we've seen with the 2020 crisis, but also there were crises at single points of the border in 2013, in 2014, in 2017 at the Bhutan China India tri junction, all since Xi Jinping took the leadership of China after a 25-year period of a lull at the border. So this is not the first boundary crisis we've seen, but it has been the most significant. Having said that, because of what we just talked about in terms of the lack of trust, even if this agreement, which they reached in Kazan, it was very important. I'm not understating its significance, but it was a tactical thought to me rather than a strategic shift. At the border, you're going to see, India say we cannot move back to status quo ante or to trusting that the agreements will hold because they didn't hold. Both sides also, since 2020, have continued to build infrastructure, continued to build up their troop presence, continued to build up their defense technology and deployments at the around the border. And so I find it very hard to believe, absent a major political realignment in thinking at the strategic level, which I don't see coming anytime soon, and I haven't seen any signs of it on either side, that absent that, you are not going to see the border itself return to normal. And so I think the border itself has changed for good in my view. The second thing is the broader relationship. Sometimes the China-India relationship or their differences are boiled down to, oh, it's the border dispute. But what we've seen is that the border dispute is just one aspect of their rivalry. There are other bilateral issues: the sharing of the river waters of the Brahmaputra, the economic asymmetry in ties, India's concerns about the vulnerability of those economic and technological ties that it's had, which it used to see as an opportunity. You've also seen regional rivalry. India concerned that now it's not just the China strengthening India's other rival, Pakistan, including helping facilitate its nuclear weapons program, but also now expanding its footprint and influence in pretty much every one of India's neighbors in ways that India sees as challenging. And there's also a fundamental difference in how India sees the region, or at least it says that for example, it never names China, but the foreign minister and others have said India wants to see a multipolar Asia, unlike some countries who want to see a unipolar Asia. And so there's a fundamental difference in how the two countries perhaps see the region. And so you've seen these broader, this is just the bilateral and regional. You can throw in their global differences as well. These are two countries who used to actually cooperate on the multilateral stage. In fact, they used to align in opposition to the US. Today, you're seeing even areas where the two countries used to align. Things like trade, climate change, non-proliferation. Today they're at loggerheads. They're also competing for influence with the developing world or the global south. And India has this sense that China is trying to hold it back on the international stage, that it's the one country that is trying to hinder India's interests or memberships in various international organizations. So you see a broader competition that I think is not going to change. And even since this agreement, this recent patrolling agreement was signed, this disengagement agreement, we've not really seen any let up in this competitive side, whether it's China and India competing in India's neighborhood, whether it is India talking to Vietnam about bolstering Vietnam's defense capabilities, or for that matter, the two sides building up their presence at the border.
Let's talk briefly about the trade relationship. Obviously, despite a relatively high level of tensions over the last 4 years, we've seen this robust trade relationship, and actually bilateral trade reached record levels in 2023. China is India's top trade partner, and bilateral trade volume in 2023 was 136 billion US dollars, and the year-on-year growth was 1.5%. So still increasing despite the tensions. We also saw increased Indian exports to China of 6% over the prior year. Of course, India's exports from China outstrip many times its exports to China. So we know that there's quite an imbalance there. But what are the prospects for the economic relationship, and how important is it?
I think the economic relationship is very interesting, and in some ways, a little bit like that between the U.S. and China. Not so much in scale. I think the U.S.-China trade dwarfs India-China trade, but in certain characteristics, in the sense that the fact that strategically both sides competing, but at the same time, trade has continued to you've seen this kind of robust trade while India has been imposing all sorts of restrictions for the last few years, some of it preceding the border standoff in 2020, but continuing after that, where India has imposed restrictions on things like Chinese investment in India. The imports have got more scrutiny, investments get more scrutiny, public procurement has been restricted. Visas have been restricted or slowed down. And so you've seen in some ways India's restrictions precede those in the US in certain grounds. India, for example, banning not just TikTok very early on after the border standoff, but a number of Chinese apps. Also, you've seen Indian law enforcement authorities go after certain Chinese companies on tax compliance or other issues, and essentially put them under greater scrutiny or restrictions overall. So you've seen a lot of restrictions, but you've also seen that while investment has come not to a grinding halt, but slowed down considerably, you've seen trade continue to grow. And some of this Indian officials recognize is natural because of two things. One, as they try to increase manufacturing in India, intermediate goods for that manufacturing still come from China. And second, as India is seeking to become part of global supply chains, and particularly other countries or companies, other MNCs, diversification strategies, they want to import goods, initial inputs for their supply chains that then they add value to and export from India. So to some extent, it's natural, but this is a major subject of discussion in India. How can you have this growing trade relationship, and particularly asymmetric relationship? Because even though Indian exports to China have grown somewhat, the gap is considerable. The Indian deficit with China has grown considerably and is a source of strain in the relationship. The Indians have said for years, long before this crisis, that this is unsustainable. Having said that, one of the things you heard in the run-up to this agreement, while these agreements were being negotiated, and keep in mind this dialogue's been going on for a while, so it wasn't entirely a surprise. But one of the sets of groups that was arguing for such an agreement was people on the economic side saying, actually, India should stabilize ties with China to be able to do more on the economic side with China, and trade more, get more investment from China, etc. And so what you've seen now, what is the driving factor? I don't believe so. I think India would not have reached this agreement if there weren't other factors. I do think this was something that was a factor that contributed, but not the primary factor, the economic side. So what do I expect now? I expect that you will see maybe a more, I don't think that we're going to see any blanket lifting of restrictions or scrutiny on Chinese activities in India, whether those are in education and civil society and the economy, telecom, technology, etc. I think you're going to see, to some extent, potentially some case by case movement in terms of Chinese investments that would help increase India's manufacturing base, increase job creation, but nothing in sensitive sectors, telecom, for example, technology. I think those sensitive sectors will still be walled off. And I think to the extent that you see investment, they'll also maybe do things like make the mechanism for scrutiny a little bit more consistent, a little bit more or fast track it in some ways. And then I think you will see India also be willing, where China can bring in some technology or help India eventually essentially take China's space in certain sectors. So, for example, manufacturing of phones or solar panels, for that matter. In those spaces, you might see India say, okay, if you do a joint venture with an Indian company, we'll allow you in. So essentially, India will try to do to China what China did to Western companies. Seek that manufacturing and eventually push Chinese companies out of it.
So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball and talk about what you think will affect the India-China relationship going forward. So first part of that, of course, is the return of Donald Trump to the presidency. They will probably, both India and China, as well as many countries in Europe and elsewhere, may have shared concerns about U.S. tariffs. That could prompt countries like India potentially to work more closely with China in order to mitigate the impact of U.S. tariffs. So how do you think that and other aspects of Trump coming to power will affect India's relationship with China? And then what are the other factors that you think are going to shape India's approach to China going forward in the next, let's say, 4 or 5 years?
So I think in some ways, even before he got reelected, Trump already affected India-China relations. And I think it was, to me, I think it was a contributing factor to both sides reaching this agreement, the uncertainty that a Trump administration might bring. So I think in some ways, Trump has already affected the relationship. I think some of it will depend on the posture that Trump takes towards China. If you're India, what you're worried about is that there will be another, that first 6 months of the Trump administration we saw the first time around, where there was a Mar-a-Lago summit where then President Trump sent a delegation to the Belt and Road Forum, that we will see another phase of that. And for India, a Trump administration that accommodates China, and they are worried that this might be possible. They are looking closely at his comments on TikTok, at the presence of people like Elon Musk and Jeff Yass around him, people who might be arguing for more engagement, more stabilization with China. For India, a Trump relationship with China that is too cozy is a problem, because they see that as potentially affecting the U.S. willingness to be a balancing power in Asia, particularly given their concerns that Trump does have a somewhat spheres of influence view of the world. And there will be concern also that China will read that, whether it's in the short term or the long term, will read that as potentially a time to maybe put pressure on India or others. Also, India will worry that a Trump that is more friendly with China, will maybe see India as less important. After all, India's role in US strategy has been elevated because of US rivalry with China, seeing India as a balancing power vis-a-vis China. So I think for India, one thing, as they're uncertain, they have wanted to make sure, and they will continue to want to make sure, that the relationship with China remains stabilized. Because as it is, as they're grappling with all the uncertainties that will come with the Trump administration, they do not want another escalation. However, if they see a Trump that is going to be kind of reaching out to China, they will worry that they will get more uncertainty from China as well, that might feel more confident. Having said that, I do think you've also seen a China that might think that Donald Trump today is reaching out, but they don't know how long it'll last. And so might actually want to keep their periphery somewhat stabilized and not kind of, and use this moment of Indian uncertainty about Trump to try to, as you mentioned earlier, Bonnie, to stabilize or to keep India from deepening ties with the US. Having said that, if you see now, as we saw in Trump 1.0, if in Trump 2.0 you see that actually US rivalry with China continues to deepen, that competitiveness continues to deepen, I think you will see an India that is actually continues to be willing to align with the US on balancing China. Because as I said, for India, this rivalry isn't just about the border, it is about a broader worldview. So I think in that case, you will see that in India, they will double down on the US, double down on the Quad, and therefore in India, that will continue to concern China. And China will continue to believe that whatever this is, but with India, it's tactical, and maybe find new ways of, just as it feels India is encircling it, that it will try to find ways of encircling India through continuing to deepen ties. So I think Trump, in some ways, has already affected the relationship and will continue to do so. The other factor, I think, in the next few years, just a couple of things so that I don't go on and on, is one, I think, whether the two sides implement these agreements and therefore move on to the next stage. Can they? I'm skeptical that they will de-induct troops, but at least de-escalate to some extent. But basically, what happens with these agreements? And then on the parallel is, what happens in these other sectors that I mentioned, the building of capabilities. Because at the moment, when both sides are uncertain about each other's intentions, they will look at capabilities, and I think they will look at the other's partnerships. So in India's case, we'll look at what China is doing in its neighborhood. And in China's case, what India is doing with the US, with Japan, with Australia, and others. And I think that will shape where both each's sense of confidence, but also their sense of the other's intentions.
Fantastic. Well, we've been talking with Dr. Tanvi Madan, who is a senior fellow in the Center for Asia Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Thanks again for joining us, Tanvi. Thanks for your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.